Night fell on St. Mary's Hospital in the small town of Oakville, Missouri. Emily Parker, a young nurse who had recently graduated, began her first night shift in the pediatric ward. She was full of enthusiasm and desire to help the little patients, but nothing could have prepared her for the horrors that awaited her that night. The ward was quiet, with only the muffled hum of medical equipment breaking the silence. Emily made her rounds, checking on the children. Everything seemed normal until she reached room 213. In this room lay an 8-year-old boy named Tommy, who had been in a coma after a car accident. When Emily entered, she felt the temperature in the room drop sharply. Her breath turned to vapor, and a chill ran down her spine. She approached Tommy's bed and froze in horror. The boy, who had been motionless for weeks, was now sitting upright, his eyes wide open but completely empty. He slowly turned his head to Emily and spoke in a voice that couldn't belong to a child. It was a deep, raspy voice that seemed to come from the depths of hell itself. Emily screamed and ran out of the room. She rushed to the nurse's station, trying to call for help, but found all the phones dead. The computers were flashing, showing strange symbols she had never seen before. Suddenly, screams and cries of children began to come from all the rooms. Emily ran down the corridor, opening doors one after another. In each room, she saw children writhing in pain, their eyes glowing with an unnatural red light. She tried to help them, but as soon as she touched anyone, she felt unbearable pain, as if thousands of needles were piercing her skin. Emily realized that something supernatural had taken over the ward. The nurse tried to escape but found all exits blocked by an invisible force. She was trapped in this nightmare, which was getting worse with every minute. Blood began to drip from the ceiling, the walls pulsating as if alive. Emily heard footsteps approaching her. From the shadows emerged a figure in an old-fashioned doctor's coat, stained with blood. His face was distorted by horrible scars, and in his hand, he held a rusty scalpel. The ghost spoke in a voice that seemed a mixture of thousands of suffering souls. "Welcome to my hospital, Nurse Parker. Here we treat the sins of humanity, and you will become our new assistant forever." Emily tried to flee, but her legs seemed rooted to the floor. She felt cold, dead hands grab her shoulders and pull her into the darkness. Her scream echoed through the hospital corridors, but no one came to help. The next morning, when the day shift arrived, they found the pediatric ward in perfect order. All the children were sleeping peacefully, and the equipment was working normally. The only strange thing was the absence of the night nurse, Emily Parker. The police conducted an investigation, but found no trace of the young woman. Surveillance cameras showed that she had entered the hospital in the evening, but never left. The only clue was a strange entry in the duty log, written in Emily's handwriting. "They came. They took me. Protect the children." Weeks after Emily's disappearance, strange things began to happen in the hospital. Nurses sometimes saw a young woman resembling Emily walking the corridors at night, but she would vanish when they tried to approach her. Children in the pediatric ward talked about a good nurse who came to them in their dreams and protected them from the bad doctor. The hospital hired psychics and paranormal researchers, but no one could solve the mystery of Emily Parker's disappearance. Some believed she had fallen victim to some supernatural evil, while others suggested she had become the hospital's guardian spirit. Over time, Emily Parker's story became an urban legend. Parents told their children that if they were good patients, the kind ghost nurse would protect them from all fears and pain. But the hospital staff continued to look at the pediatric ward with fear, especially at night, when the shadows seemed deeper and the silence more ominous. Years passed, but the mystery of that night remained unsolved. St. Mary's Hospital continued to operate, saving lives and easing suffering. But everyone who passed by room 213 felt a chill down their spine and heard a faint whisper, "They're coming. They're coming for all of us." This story became a warning for everyone working in the medical field. It reminded them that sometimes the line between life and death, between this world and the beyond, can be thinner than we think. and that within hospital walls, secrets and horrors that go beyond human understanding can hide. Emily Parker, a young nurse who came to the hospital hoping to help and heal, became part of something bigger and more terrifying. Her fate remained a mystery, but her presence continued to be felt in the corridors and wards of St. Mary's Hospital, reminding everyone that sometimes the greatest horrors can lurk where we seek healing and hope. The abandoned Blackwood Sanatorium loomed over the small town of Millbrook, Connecticut, its decaying facade a stark reminder of the dark history that clung to its walls. Dr. Sarah Collins, a renowned psychiatrist specializing in paranormal phenomena, had been called to investigate a series of unexplained events that had been plaguing the local hospital. Little did she know that her journey into the depths of human suffering and supernatural terror was about to begin. The trouble started when Millbrook General Hospital began experiencing a surge of patients exhibiting bizarre symptoms. People were admitted with complaints of hearing whispers in empty rooms, seeing shadowy figures at the foot of their beds, and experiencing vivid nightmares that left them screaming in the middle of the night. The hospital staff was at a loss, unable to diagnose or treat these mysterious ailments. Dr. Collins arrived on a gloomy autumn evening, the air thick with fog that seemed to wrap around the hospital like a shroud. As she entered the building, she felt an immediate sense of unease, as if the very walls were watching her. The fluorescent lights flickered ominously, casting eerie shadows in the long, sterile corridors. Her first stop was the psychiatric ward, where the most severe cases were being held. The ward was unnaturally quiet, save for the occasional whimper or muffled scream from behind closed doors. As she reviewed patient files, Dr. Collins noticed a disturbing pattern. Many of the affected individuals had some connection to the old Blackwood Sanatorium, either as former patients or descendants of those who had been institutionalized there. Intrigued by this connection, Dr. Collins decided to delve deeper into the sanatorium's history. She discovered that Blackwood had been shut down in the 1960s following a series of gruesome deaths and allegations of unethical experiments conducted on patients. The details were vague, but there were whispers of a doctor who had become obsessed with exploring the boundaries between life and death. As she continued her investigation, strange occurrences began to plague Dr. Collins herself. She would catch glimpses of a figure in a blood-stained doctor's coat out of the corner of her eye, only to find nothing when she turned to look. The temperature in rooms would drop dramatically when she entered, her breath visible in the suddenly frigid air. At night, she was tormented by vivid dreams of screaming patients strapped to operating tables, their bodies contorted in agony. Despite her growing fear, Dr. Collins pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. She spent long hours in the hospital's archives, poring over old records and forgotten files. It was there that she stumbled upon a chilling discovery: a series of journal entries written by Dr. Elias Blackwood, the sanatorium's founder and chief physician. The entries detailed Dr. Blackwood's descent into madness as he became consumed by his experiments. He wrote of attempting to harness the energy of human suffering to bridge the gap between the world of the living and the dead. The final entry, dated just days before the sanatorium's closure, hinted at a ritual that would bind his spirit to the hospital forever, allowing him to continue his work even after death. As Dr. Collins read the final words, the lights in the archive room suddenly went out, plunging her into darkness. The temperature plummeted, and she could hear the sound of slow, deliberate footsteps approaching. Panicked, she fumbled for her phone, using its light to guide her way out of the room. As she reached the door, she saw a figure standing in the hallway, a tall man in an old-fashioned doctor's coat, his face hidden in shadow. Dr. Collins fled the hospital, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she had stumbled upon something far more sinister than she had initially believed. The next day, she returned with a team of paranormal investigators, determined to put an end to whatever malevolent force was haunting the hospital. As they set up their equipment, strange phenomena began to occur with increasing frequency. Doors slammed shut on their own, objects moved without being touched, and eerie whispers echoed through the halls. The investigators' equipment malfunctioned, showing impossible readings and capturing distorted images of a figure that seemed to be everywhere at once. The situation came to a head when one of the investigators was found unconscious in the basement, his body covered in inexplicable surgical incisions. As they rushed him to the emergency room, Dr. Collins realized with horror that the markings matched those described in Dr. Blackwood's journal, the first step in his twisted ritual to bind a soul to the hospital. Knowing they were running out of time, Dr. Collins made the difficult decision to return to the abandoned Blackwood Sanatorium. She believed that the key to ending the haunting lay within its crumbling walls. As she approached the derelict building, she could feel an oppressive energy radiating from within, as if the very air was charged with malevolence. Inside, the sanatorium was a maze of decay and shadows. Dr. Collins navigated the treacherous hallways, her flashlight beam revealing glimpses of rusted medical equipment and moldering patient files. As she descended into the bowels of the building, she began to hear whispers and screams echoing from the walls, the anguished voices of those who had suffered within these walls. In the deepest sublevel, Dr. Collins discovered a hidden chamber that had been sealed off for decades. The room was circular, with strange symbols carved into the floor and walls. In the center stood an ancient operating table, stained with what could only be blood. As she approached, she felt a presence materialize behind her. Dr. Blackwood's spirit, now a twisted and malevolent entity, confronted Dr. Collins. The air crackled with otherworldly energy as the two engaged in a battle of wills. Dr. Collins used her knowledge of psychology and the paranormal to counter the spirit's attacks, all while trying to unravel the secrets of the ritual that bound him to this plane. In a desperate gambit, Dr. Collins began to recite an incantation she had pieced together from Dr. Blackwood's journals, hoping to reverse the binding ritual. As she spoke the words, the room began to shake, and unearthly screams filled the air. The spirit of Dr. Blackwood fought back with all its might, unleashing a barrage of psychic assaults that threatened to overwhelm her. Just when it seemed that all hope was lost, Dr. Collins felt a surge of energy flow through her. The spirits of Dr. Blackwood's victims, long trapped in the sanatorium, lent her their strength. With their combined power, she was able to complete the ritual, breaking the bonds that held the malevolent doctor's spirit to the mortal world. In a final, cataclysmic moment, the spirit of Dr. Blackwood was torn from our reality, dragged screaming into whatever hell awaited him. The sanatorium itself began to collapse, as if the very foundations of the building had been tied to the evil that once dwelled within it. Dr. Collins barely managed to escape as the structure crumbled behind her. In the aftermath, the strange occurrences at Millbrook General Hospital ceased. The affected patients began to recover, their nightmares and hallucinations fading away. Dr. Collins, forever changed by her experience, devoted the rest of her career to helping those affected by paranormal trauma, always watchful for signs that the barrier between worlds might once again be breached. The ruins of Blackwood Sanatorium stood as a grim reminder of the horrors that had transpired, a monument to human suffering and the dangers of pushing the boundaries of science and spirituality too far. And though the evil that once resided there had been vanquished, those who passed by the site at night would sometimes swear they could hear the faint echoes of screams on the wind, a chilling reminder that some scars never truly heal. In the quiet town of Pine Creek, Oregon, stood the Old St. Agnes Hospital. Built in the early 20th century, it held many secrets behind its dilapidated walls. Dr. Michael Stern, an experienced surgeon, had recently moved to town and started working at this hospital. He had no idea that he was about to encounter something inexplicable and terrifying. It all began on a full moon night. Michael was on duty in the emergency department when a patient with a severe head injury was brought in. The middle-aged man was unconscious, his face disfigured beyond recognition. The doctors fought for his life for several hours, but ultimately pronounced him dead. When Michael left the operating room, he felt a strange unease. The hospital corridors seemed longer and darker than usual, and there was a faint smell of decay in the air. He attributed this to fatigue and stress after the difficult operation. The next night, Michael was awakened by a call from the hospital. A nurse frantically reported that the body of the patient who had died the day before had disappeared from the morgue. The surveillance cameras hadn't recorded anything unusual, and the doors were locked. It seemed as if the body had simply vanished. Arriving at the hospital, Michael found all the staff frightened and confused. No one could explain the disappearance of the body. The police began an investigation, but found no clues. From that moment on, strange things began to happen in the hospital. Patients complained of horrible nightmares in which they were pursued by a man with a disfigured face. Nurses reported unexplained sounds and moving shadows in empty wards. Michael tried to find a rational explanation for what was happening, but it became increasingly difficult with each passing day. He began to notice that some patients recovered unexplainably quickly, while others' conditions deteriorated sharply without apparent reason. One night, while doing his rounds, Michael heard strange sounds coming from the hospital basement. Going down, he discovered an old, abandoned operating room that no one knew existed. In the center of the room stood a rusty operating table covered in dried blood. Suddenly, the lights went out, and Michael found himself in complete darkness. He felt someone's presence behind him and turned sharply. In the dim emergency lighting, he saw the figure of a man with a disfigured face, the very patient they had failed to save. The ghost moved towards Michael, reaching out its hands. The doctor tried to run away in horror, but found the door locked. He felt cold fingers touching his neck, and at that moment, he lost consciousness. Michael woke up in his office. He didn't remember how he got out of the basement. Colleagues said they found him sleeping at his desk and decided not to wake him. Michael tried to tell them about his experience, but no one believed him. In the following days, Michael noticed that he had acquired a strange ability. He could foresee which patients would recover and which would die. This frightened him, but also helped him save lives. He began to research the history of the hospital and discovered that at the beginning of the century, a surgeon had worked here, conducting illegal experiments on patients. This doctor had died under mysterious circumstances, and his body was never found. Michael realized that the ghost of this surgeon still inhabited the hospital walls, continuing his experiments with life and death. He decided to put an end to this and free the trapped souls of the patients. On the full moon, exactly a month after the ghost's appearance, Michael went down to the basement with an ancient spell book he had found in the city library. He began to read the exorcism ritual, feeling the darkness gathering around him. The ghost appeared again, but this time Michael was ready. He continued to read the spell despite attacks from an invisible force. The walls shook, medical instruments flew around the room, but Michael didn't give up. At the climax of the ritual, there was a deafening scream, and the ghost dissolved into the air. The hospital shuddered as if from an earthquake, and then everything went quiet. After that night, the strange events in the hospital stopped. Patients no longer complained of nightmares, and recovery proceeded naturally. Michael lost his supernatural ability, but was only glad of it. However, the memory of the horror he experienced stayed with him forever. Every time he went down to the hospital basement, he felt a slight chill down his spine, reminding him of the night when he encountered the unknown. The story of the surgeon's ghost and the doctor who defeated it became an urban legend. Many didn't believe it, considering it fiction, but the patients of St. Agnes Hospital always felt a special atmosphere within its walls, an atmosphere where the line between life and death, science, and the supernatural became incredibly thin.